Hello, good afternoon, and welcome back for the last segment of the high-level conference for a people-centered eJustice. Hope you had time to relax and to energize for some more debates. If you are just joining now, we remember this conference is being held in Portuguese and English languages, with streaming into different rooms for your comfort. Please choose the one to follow. The next presentation covers the environment surrounding both technology and justice. And I dare to underline at this moment a few extraordinary changes in people's behavior over the past 10 years or so. Beginning with privacy. Privacy was an almost religious value for most of the so-called Western societies. And then appeared social media. In a blink, millions of people decided to share their privacy, showing the roommate, their home, children, pets, vacations, breakfast and fancy dinners, all with the added glow of the filters. For those who remember the thinker Habermas, if we shrink our privacy and intimate circles, we are at the same time enlarging the public sphere surrounding us. And it is in the public sphere that happens most of our social interactions. This should also be a whisper for journalists, because it is in the public space that news takes shape. Second, the written and the spoken word. Yesterday, Justice Cunha Rodrigues underlined the need to embrace oral procedures in justice. I tend to agree with him, but in fact, the most powerful impact nowadays is through visual media. Instagram, for instance. Written words are pushed away to the far corner of an hashtag or a brief caption below a picture. Finally, convenience. I remember the shouting screams around the first ideas of a single ID card for each citizen, providing public and private sectors the core ID details about each individual. There was at the time an outcry, at least here in Portugal. Nowadays, it's quite the opposite. So we have the identity card with a chip on it, sharing all our public, or most of our public information. So something really changed about the regular concept of privacy. And all of this, I think, build up the environment. For the first keynote of the afternoon, we welcome on stage Gillian Hadfield. Is a Schwartz Reisman Chair in Technology and Society from the University of Toronto. He will be talking about technology, strengthening of justice. What enabling environment? That's the question. The stage is yours. Welcome.
Hi, everybody. I'm Gillian Hadfield. I'm really sorry I can't be with you to give this talk in person, but I'm really excited to be joining your conversation. It's really important work we're all doing. And I'm going to talk about some ideas that I talk about in my book, Rules for a Flat World, critically how we need to reform the regulatory structures of law in order to achieve our goals with eJustice. So let's start thinking about what's possible in law. Well, one of the things that's possible is just the internet. We're not making very much use of it today, but we could be using it a lot more in the legal sphere. We could be using it for more online legal information and online legal advice, for online dispute resolution, for web-based lawyer and client relationship management. And my favorite is to think about how we might have more apps that on our smartphones that help us interpret and understand legal documents, and even the capacity for filing forms and claims. So that's just using the technology that we have today, clearly available to us. Let's also think about what's possible with artificial intelligence. This is something that I spent a lot of time thinking about these days. Well, we're already seeing artificial intelligence being used in fields like legal research, and we could be moving up the scale in terms of using AI to help us with giving people rapid, accurate legal advice. We could be talking about the use of building artificial intelligence that can help identify claims, maybe even help us file those claims, maybe even help us decide disputes, expanding access to dispute resolution. AI is already helping us draft documents, legal documents, and we can imagine building artificial intelligence would help us interpret documents. And how about blockchains? Blockchain is something that's emerging to a great extent in the financial fields, and I think there's plenty of opportunity to look to blockchain technologies to help advance our access to justice goals. We're seeing digital currencies, of course. We could be, and we're starting to see the increase in use of digital assets and digital recordation. I think blockchain holds out the promise for potentially building much more accessible transactional platforms that are trans-border. And of course, smart contracts, maybe even execution of judgments, which is something that really blocks access to justice in a lot of countries where courts are difficult to access. And I think we can be looking down the road at blockchain-based dispute resolution platforms. So the question I want to explore with you is whether or not legal regulation is preventing the emergence of new technologies that could be assisting us in our access to justice problems. And I think the answer is very clearly yes. And this is especially the case for ordinary people and small businesses. So what I want to talk about is why this is the case. How is legal regulation getting in the way of our transformations? And the answer has to do with business models. This is where being economist comes in. Our business models for law determine who can provide legal services, who can invest in legal businesses, and who can build our legal technologies. It determines how legal services are paid for, how legal technologies are financed, and how the incentives to produce these technologies are secured. The key point I want to really emphasize to you is that legal regulation is economic regulation, and it presumes and bakes in traditional lawyering. And this is because our legal regulation systems focus on licensing lawyers, people. We do this by having educational requirements, licensure requirements like the passage of a bar exam, and moral character requirements. And nothing I'm going to say here today says we shouldn't have those requirements for lawyers. But what this excludes is the capacity to help allow tech companies to become authorized providers of legal services. We just don't have the regulatory system in place to allow tech companies to become authorized providers. And a lot of our rules in a lot of locations also mean that tech companies can't explicitly partner with or hire licensed lawyers. This is the case in the United States, for example, in most jurisdictions. Now, you may be thinking, so what? Doesn't matter that tech companies can't become licensed providers because society doesn't really need legal technologies, or lawyers could just hire and buy the legal technologies. Let's look at these in turn. So let's look at this first one. Society just doesn't need legal technologies. Well, the problem here is that law is really an essential platform for our economic activity, for social stability, for social interaction and economic growth. I think of law as our legal infrastructure. That's an essential platform. And the last several decades, of course, we've seen tremendous transformation in the way the economy works. We've got global web-based platforms, we've got global supply chains, global markets, mass digitization, globalization, marketization, the emergence of huge platforms, social media platforms and transactional platforms, and we're starting to see the emergence of increased use of robots and algorithms. And that economic transformation is transforming what I call the economic demand for legal infrastructure, the legal infrastructure necessary to support those new ways of interacting in the economic space. So the answer to the question, does society need legal technologies, is yes, it does, because it needs faster and more agile solutions for the economy to thrive. So let's look at the second response to the question, the so what question. Well, lawyers can buy technology. Well, but that's only going to be true for the things that lawyers think about. And innovation requires profit and mission incentives for tech developers and entrepreneurs to think of what might be possible with technology. And lawyers will only buy technologies for the things that lawyers for which lawyers are willing to bear the risk. But innovation requires that we move our risk bearing from less to more diversified actors. And lawyers are pretty undiversified. But law is like every other sector. It takes diversity. Innovation in law will take diversity, feedback, and risk-taking. And legal technologies just won't be invented for lawyers to purchase unless we incentivize people to take those risks, invest in those technologies, and invent them. So now you may also be thinking, but aren't these technologies already being invented? Haven't I heard lots of stories about legal technologies and AI taking all of lawyers' jobs? The problem here is that the innovation we are currently seeing is only technology that is available to the largest corporate clients. These are the only clients that can purchase these technologies largely through in-house lawyers. And that means we're actually seeing a substitution away from outside counsel in our large corporate sectors, cutting out traditional lawyers and pulling those technologies inside. And that's excluding our medium and small size business. And it's excluding ordinary citizens from the benefits of legal technologies. So I really think that if we don't change our approach to legal regulation, we're deepening the growing inequality between big and small companies and between corporations and citizens. And as we know, that divide is just growing huge these days. I know most of you have seen this map from the World Justice Project on proportion of people who've experienced legal problems in the last 2 years. And the green at the bottom are the lowest numbers, 14%. The deeper orange colors are the highest percentages at 89%. And you can see that Europe, as with a lot of North America, is a lot into the orange, which are high proportions of people experiencing legal problems. And we also know from the World Justice Project that almost 51% of people who have legal problems are unable to meet those civil justice needs. Well, the question is, why is that happening? Why is it that there's that massive gap in the capacity to address legal problems? Well, the answer is an economic one. Legal help is just too expensive for most people. We know that there are other answers that we get when we look at this question, such as people don't know they have a legal problem, or they don't know where to go, they don't know how to identify legal help. But that too is a consequence of the fact that legal help is too expensive. And so we just don't have the infrastructure that's built up to help people understand what their legal problems are, and to direct them to help. We haven't figured out how to bring down that cost. The question for that now is why? And the answer that I think is really important to focus on is the fact that the conventional practice of law, the lawyer in their office, dealing with clients face to face, the system we invented in the 19th century or earlier, that conventional practice of law is just extremely inefficient. And the back of the envelope calculation, I'm going to suggest it's maybe even as much as 80% inefficiency. So where did this number come from? This is based on US data, a survey done by Clio, which provides software to law firms and billing software, and so has capacity to analyze the billing of a lot of small law firms. These are mostly law firms that are less than 12 lawyers. That's the size of law firm that deals with the needs of ordinary individuals. And what we see if we look at that data is that, this is from 2019, in an average 8-hour day, a lawyer in a business like this in the United States is doing billable work only 2.3 hours a day. He or she is actually billing for their work only 1.9 hours a day, and they're actually getting paid only for 1.6 hours in a day. So working an 8-hour day, but only getting paid for 1.6 hours. So if you think that imagine that those lawyers are charging, say, $200 an hour, which is actually a low estimate for averages for lawyers in the sector, that's like earning $300 a day or $72,000 a year as revenues into a law firm before you've paid payroll, an assistant, for example, or expenses like technology and rent. And that is not a very high income for a professional in the United States. Now, you can also see this in census data. It's not only from the survey data, and the last year for which we have the data that shows us this is 2007 in the United States again. And what this graph shows is law firms ordered in terms of their annual revenues. From the bucket at the bottom is the 0 to 10,000 a year. The buckets at the top are 5 million, 10 million and above. And if you look at the bottom 40th percentile, bottom 40% of that distribution, which is probably roughly aligns with the law firms that serve ordinary individuals rather than large corporations, what you see in that group is that the average revenues, this is 2007, so it's a little low now, but it's $132,000 in average revenues. After payroll, it's about $89,000 in revenues. Now, of course, out of that, you still have to pay insurance and rent and technology and so on. So we don't know exactly because this isn't tracked. This data is not tracked. But that suggests that the average take home for the lawyers at this bottom 40% is maybe $65,000. Again, that is not very high, but it gives us confirmation of the calculation from the Clio data that lawyers serving ordinary individuals are not making a lot of money, and yet the rates that they have to charge in order to earn that relatively low income are still too high for most people. And that's what we see in this on this schematic demand curve. I'm showing here demand as a decreasing function of price, and saying, you know, for the companies, clients who can afford the highest rates, let's just call it $600 an hour. Those are big businesses. If you can bring those rates down to $450 or something, you can bring in some other businesses. And at $200, which is the number actually kind of low that I'm suggesting we look at for the cost to ordinary citizens, we see that there's some people who can afford that. There's people who have some wealth and maybe no choice about hiring a lawyer. But I just want you to do the thought experiment and say, well, if you reduce that price down to $40 an hour, many, many more people could get access to legal services. And that $40 an hour is really what it works out to, that our lawyers who are making $65,000, $70,000 a year in those previous calculations, if you actually average their earnings across their full day and not just the hours that they're collecting for in contact doing billable work, that's what's coming out to about $40 an hour. And that difference between the 200 and the 40 is what I'm calling the inefficiency here. That's the portion that is not going to compensate lawyers for their legal work. That's going to all the other things it takes to operate a legal business, find clients, to achieve scale, to collect payment, to research technologies, and so on. And here's the key point. Dramatic cost reductions, which is what we have to achieve in order to increase access to justice, are only possible with digital delivery models achieved at scale. We simply cannot address our access to justice crisis throughout the world unless we move from the current traditional model of law, face-to-face, in an office, and so on. We don't want to get rid of that, but we have to vastly expand our use of digital technologies, and that has to happen at scale. And those digital delivery models at scale will not emerge without corporate form and revenue sharing business models. There has actually been some in the last several years in the United States. We've seen a number of increasing uses of technology to increase that access, bring down those costs. So things like Avo Advisor, which is a platform that connected people to lawyers for, say, 15 minutes of lawyer advice for only $39. Or UpCounsel, which connected small businesses, medium-sized businesses, to lawyers who in the large law firms were charging $600 and above, connecting those businesses to those lawyers for, say, $250 an hour by increasing the efficiency of the business model. Or companies like Law Good that are using AI to develop contracts, AI-based contract review. Now, the thing to know about all of these is that they have actually all been closed down. Avo Advisor and UpCounsel have been either closed down or threatened by enforcement from bar associations that say this violates the regulatory, the professional regulation model, or companies like Law Good that actually start out wanting to provide services to ordinary individuals, small businesses, independent contractors, gig workers, and so on, but who find that the only market that they can address without running the risk of regulatory violation are larger corporate markets. So what does that mean? That means that for these new models, these digital models at scale, require to achieve those, we are going to need regulatory models that will assure that quality, ethics, and protection of the public is achieved in this new environment. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to design new regulatory models, and we need to reform the professional regulation of lawyers. And I really do think this is quite critical. We need to support the creation of entity regulation regimes. That's to say, regulation regimes that allow a tech company to become a licensed provider and allow the practice of law by corporations and allow fee sharing between lawyers and corporations. Now, Europe has led the way in the past, and in the early 2000s, Europe actually triggered a significant amount of the change we did see in the UK later in 2007, 2012, by making it clear that professional regulation needs to be reviewed against the standards of competition law and mobility law, which is to say we have to be able to look at our professional regulation of lawyers and decide that it's actually serving the public interest. So Europe has led the way in the past. The UK followed in later 2000s with some significant changes. But today, the state of Utah in the United States is leading the way. And I've been involved in reform efforts here to make the kind of changes that I really think are critical for the emergence of increased technology and cost reduction in law. What they're doing in Utah is removing the restrictions on lawyers' business models. And they're doing that with rule changes. They're building a pilot regulator that can license companies and organizations. And they're inviting innovators into a sandbox to work with the regulator to build the data that you need for a risk-appropriate approach to regulation. And they're regulating the quality, integrity of a service, the service that's provided, and not the business model of the provider. So they are looking at data to say, what is the risk to a consumer of accessing this new technology-based legal service, the service from a tech company, for example, and asking what's the risk to the consumer and comparing that risk for the consumer to the risk of not having access to that service. As we know, in many cases, that means not having access to any kind of help. This is what is referred to as risk-based or evidence-based regulation, and it's where we all need to be headed. So I want to conclude by just emphasizing that success for the people-centered eJustice initiatives throughout the EU absolutely requires coordinated regulatory reform. We have good maps for how to do this. It's straightforward to do it, and I'm happy to help. And I really wish I could be with you to talk some more about it in person, but I look forward to what you produce. Thank you.